My father was born in 1892 in Kana, now Lebanon, and was Syria then. When he was 14 years old, the Turkish army was conscripting people into the Turkish army. So he and his older brother, who was 16 at the time, followed their father's advice and left the country. They moved to Michigan City, Indiana, just like so many of the other Arabs who came to this country.
Well, they had boarded a train and were making their way. They got as far as New Mexico, and the train was actually stopped by Mexican bandits. My great-grandfather was carrying a very small box of Ottoman gold coins that he had brought with him. He threw the box underneath the train to try to hide it, and they saw him do it. They slit his throat and the throat of his brother. This was recorded actually in a newspaper article that we dug up at the Smithsonian Institute. They referred to them as Turks, because they had come from Lebanon when the Ottomans were still occupying, that part of the world.
My mother's father, Haj Ahmed Ajmi, who came over, was the first, they said the first Muslim from the United States to go and make Hajj, and definitely the first one from Indiana or Michigan, and that was a long, long time ago, but he was probably one of the first Hajjs to become a Hajj from America. I was told for my mother's father, while he was working in the foundries at Pullman Train Factory, that when it was prayer time, that his foreman, my grandfather, was skipping his lunch break so he could have time for his salat. The foreman found out what he was doing and said, no, you can still have your lunch break and do your salat.
My parents came from Lebanon, village of Bint Jbal, around 1908, 1910. For the purpose was to work at the car factory, which was known as Pullman Standard.
On my father's side of the family, my grandfather was working at the Pullman car factory at the time. It was a factory that built these real fancy train cars for people that could afford to travel in them.
Pullman was a big company at that time, Haskell Pullman, and they made rail cars. And I'm sure what they did is that they went to the ports as these immigrants got off the boats. They offered them jobs, and that's how he came here. He lived with a family, a Muslim family, had one room, and he lived there and worked, and he would send every month all the money he had back to Lebanon to support his father and his brothers and his sisters. And he was here for 50 years before he went back.
Everybody would be standing in line for a job, and it was somebody like the superintendent or the foreman. He would come out and he'd say, you, okay, enough for today. And he went for God knows how long, and he finally hired in 1936. They were Muslims, and I guess they practiced their faith to an extent. And I remember, well, my grandmother died, my mother's mother, when I was 8 years old. And I remember her praying. She was old and she had all kinds of health problems, and I remember her sitting on the bed and praying.
They had excellent relationships with the Christians. They were like brothers and sisters, and they had a great Muslim community. And my father learned to read and write Arabic, and he read the Quran at a very young age. And his father would take him to all the meetings that he had at the mosque in Michigan City. So he was really raised with the great knowledge of Islam.
My parents were a lot more strict than other parents were. We weren't allowed to have sleepovers, we weren't allowed to do this, we weren't allowed to do that. And even as a child, we didn't wear certain clothing. We were more conservative.
He left Lebanon to escape the Ottomans. The Turks were coming through the Mediterranean and hitting a lot of the villages, and any boys 13 and over, boom, you're in the Ottoman army, and a lot of families would never see those young boys again.
Many of those individuals who came to the United States were driven by famine and poverty and lack of job opportunities. under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, unfortunately, at some point of history, it showed some hostility toward the Shia minorities living in the big Ottoman Empire, including Shia in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in other places. Shia were being persecuted. Many of them were forced to go to aimless wars that the Ottoman Empire used to launch mostly in Europe. Shia families in the Middle East, they feared for the future of their young children, that if they stay in the Middle East, ultimately they will have to go to the war and be ultimately killed. So they encouraged their young children to migrate, and this is exactly what happened.
This is a picture from about 1920 or 21. This is my grandfather, my mother's father, her two brothers, the one who died in the air crash, Ali, as well as her sister Mary, and my mother is the baby sitting on the lap. And my mother would always say, if you look at his shoes, you could tell they're dusty. He must have just came home from work when they took that picture. This was one of my mom's siblings. His name was Mustafa, that I know. He died as an infant, and probably, from what my mom tells me, it probably was what we would call crib death in the 20s.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The war breaks out, everybody enlists. My Uncle Ali was a tough guy. I mean, a real tough guy. He got sent to Alaska. They felt that the Japanese would use the Aleutian Islands and come in through Alaska, through the north. They flew out of there in a transport plane, and the plane hit a mountain, and they never discovered Uncle Al for 5 years. Him and 10 other soldiers. Sitto went to Washington, D.C. I'm telling you, my Sitto is an amazing woman. She wanted to talk to the president. My grandmother could not let go that he wasn't still alive. She said he was still, she kept hope in her heart that he was still alive. And my grandfather would say to her that if Ali was still alive, he would find a way to come home. Unfortunately, it never happened. They found the wreckage in 1948.
This is a picture of my husband and his older brother, Ali and Hussein. And they had another brother that passed away whose name was Hassan. My husband was born in 1935, and Ali was born in 1931. And these are pictures of my parents. This is my father, Hussein Wazni, and my mother was Maliki Ahmad from Beit al-Hamad. And most people here in the U.S. couldn't say Hussein when my father came, so they called him Hassan. My father came to the U.S. in 1906, and my mother was born here in 1917, and then went back to Lebanon and came back in the early 30s.
The first wave of immigration of the Shia immigrants arrived in the United States in the late 19th century. That was around almost 1880 or 1890, when first immigrants from southern Lebanon arrived into the state of Indiana, to a city known as Michigan City. This city was a blue-collar city where steel was being extracted from the mines. And that business had attracted many early immigrants to move to this particular city.
They were laborers, some of them farmers. They came searching for an economic opportunity. Sometimes an entire village in Lebanon would migrate to America. Between 1920s and 1930s, this was the main influx of the Shia Muslim immigrants, primarily from Lebanon to Michigan City. At one point, Michigan City was heavily populated by Muslim immigrants, Sunnis and Shias both. At one point, we read that the number of families reached 200, almost, between 800 and 1,000 people, which is, 100 years ago, this is a big number. They established the first Shia Muslim mosque in Michigan City back in 1924. And then after that, followed by many other cultural, if you will, cultural institutions.
During the year about 1911, 1912 was from my understanding, is they formed an organization for religious and social activities to promote Islam. At that time, they used to meet what was called the American Restaurant. Then they purchased a building and converted it into a gathering. From there, they had the religious activities, they had Friday prayers, they had regular Sunday school and so forth. And then they were incorporated in May of 1924. At that time, there was quite a few Middle Eastern Muslims in Michigan City at that time. There was the Hakim family, our family, the Alwins, the Hashimis, the Waznis, the Ayeds. I mean, there was quite a few families. And it was decided they should organize. And the children coming up and bring needed religious training. They felt very strongly about that. I remember being told that several times. So they had teachers. They had some of our people who were teaching us. I mean, I remember as a young boy being taught on the Asr al-Jadid is what it was called. We'd be upstairs. They'd have regular Sunday school for us. The women would be downstairs making breakfast and everything. Afterwards, we used to have our breakfast. Then we go up and it was time for Salli. We used to bring out the straw mat and have Salli and everything.
The community started out, as I say, it was basically a social place. We had what they called Asr al-Jadid, and it was just a building. And upstairs we would hold prayers sometimes, and we did other things. And the downstairs was more social. We got together, we had Sunday schools, and we had people, most of them were American born, that would teach us about Islam and taught us to pray.
In 1914, they had a group called the Badr al-Munir Society. In 1924, they were incorporated as the Asr al-Jadid, and that became our first Islamic center. So we're coming on 97 years, 3 more years, so it'll be 100 years since they were incorporated as an Islamic center. We believe Iowa had the first building on site in Cedar Rapids, but we had the first articles of incorporation for an Islamic center in the United States. I remember that, with vague memories of what was there, and we went up a narrow stairway to the prayer room, and the prayer room upstairs had the old straw mats all over the prayer room, the big giant straw mats. And I remember everybody was old and we would pray up there. And to this day, if I pray on a straw mat, it brings me memories of when I was 3, 4, 5 years old at the Asr al-Jadid praying with everybody up there. We bought this place in 1971.
This here may be harder to see. This is a picture, remember, this is Michigan City, Indiana, the Asr al-Jadid. I could point out my mother to you, and even Kathy's father is in this picture. This was the whole community back in Michigan City, and this appears to have been a holiday. That's why they're all out there.
This is just about the Islamic Center in Michigan City. This is what it presently looks like, and this was the old Asr al-Jadid, which was the first one, which was built in 1924. This is the man, his name was Hussein Bodib Muhammad, in 1914 that organized the first Islamic center in Michigan City. Even though it wasn't a religious place, it was more social.
As a little boy, I didn't hear the terms Shia and Sunni. We were all Muslims and we were together. Our mashayikh, our imams were Shia. This is one of the few centers in the United States that never made a distinction who you are when you come in. This was all Muslims were welcome. And for a period we had a large Sunni presence. The Sunni brothers and sisters were a large part of our community. Probably from 1980 on, it became more and more apparent. And the more we studied, the more we realized we were maybe lacking in that area.
The word Shia never came up. He prayed, he fasted, he talked about Islam and that we were Muslims, but the word Shia never came up until I was almost an adult. Because everybody in Michigan City, the Muslims were all Shia. And it wasn't something that they talked about. And that afterwards, it always surprised me.
It seems like the Sunni Shia thing has really been since all of this turmoil in the Middle East. At least that's what appears to us. Maybe it always went on over there, but I don't know. But it was never a big deal.
When we were growing up, we didn't even know about Shia and Sunni. We were just all Arabs. I never heard the word Sunni until I was much, much older.
I prayed next to Sunnis on one side and Shia on the other, and to tell you the truth, we didn't know the difference. I didn't really know that there was a Sunni or that there was a Shia growing up until a little later on in life. Really, not until probably the mid-60s.
At that time, I didn't know if I was Shia or Sunni. Wallah, I did not know that. I was not aware of it until my wife and I were married and we were out to dinner with some friends of ours and everything. And come to find out, they ask. And they say, oh, you're Shia. And I remember the wife and I looked at each other and said, what are they talking about? So I asked my mom. First thing out of her mouth, where'd you hear that? I said, well, you were out and all. I said, she says, yes, you're Shia faith, but you're Muslim. Remember that, you're Muslim. To this very day, at this Jama right here, we have Sunni and Shia. And when we come to pray, we pray together.
We always fasted. Ramadan was very important, but Ashura and Muharram were just words. We didn't practice them as we do today. And even as my children got older, we commemorated Ashura and Muharram with the first 10 days, of course, and big things. But I don't remember growing up with it. And I remember after it was the 70s, we were able to get a reader that came for Ashura, and it was probably one of the first times I'd heard it being read by somebody who knew what they were doing. My husband did a lot of it for Ashura, but he did it in English. He would every night he had the story of one of the imams or the families, and he would, so we knew something of the history, and that's where I've learned it from. And he would present it in English, and then my husband could read and write Arabic, but somebody else would always read it in Arabic afterwards. But I think a lot of the people, since we were English speaking to begin with, we appreciated the background, because when you hear it in Arabic, if you don't know Arabic, it doesn't mean much. And even my children. And my husband wrote a lecture for every night of the 10 nights. And I still have them, and in fact, even now in Ashura, I read them.
Probably for me, the earliest memories of commemoration of Muharram, probably 1980s. 1960s and 70s, I don't remember. I remember always Eid al-Adha, Eid al-Fitr, and the picnics and your child and you know, coming and working here, cleaning here, doing the things we did to maintain the place, having our Sunday school classes. Our Islam was good. Our teachers were good, gave us some strong fundamentals on prayer and fasting, things like that. But, you know, we know now, you know, without understanding Ahlulbayt and our imamat and understanding the love of Ahlulbayt and why it's so necessary for us, that we were probably missing out a lot in those early days. When my father was dying, the last 3 weeks of his life, he couldn't walk, but he still was asking me, go get this book from Imam Khou'i, go get this book from Sayyid Jalali, and giving me, asking me to bring him books, and he was still reading up until his last 3 or 4 days. And imagine, your time is ending, things are shutting down, and it's very powerful. Not just the sadness of losing your father, but the inspiration of, here's a man who is going to die any day. And I would ask him, is there anything you need? Are we forgetting anything? Anything you need like this? And, what do you want? What do you need from me? And he said, I'm ready when Allah wants me. Each time, I'm ready when Allah wants me.
I just turned 80 years old a couple weeks ago. And I can remember when till it is now. And I am proud, because when we first came here, just purchasing this building here, we were the only mosque around. Now, smother, look around. We're all over. I just feel good. I feel proud. And I can say that we're making our mark in this world. That's all I can say.
They came with nothing and established not just their deen, their iman, but they set up something for their children, set up something for the communities. It's an honor, but it's a responsibility. You're happy to be part of a center that's almost 100 years old, happy to remember those stories and the people that came before us. And inshallah, my children will carry on.